Welcome to our lectures on the use of patristic studies in engaging Chinese culture, a medical case study. Now we move on to topic 2, where we compare patristics and Chinese medical anthropologies. Let me begin with a short review of our first lecture. Now, in the previous lecture, we looked at why it is important to reflect theologically on Chinese medicine. And there were 3 reasons that we specified. Number 1, this was a tangible means of loving our Chinese neighbor, who may see this as a premature dismissal of Chinese medicine as a kind of cultural imperialism at work. Number 2, we needed to assess whether it is theologically legitimate for Christians to use Chinese medicine. And number 3, the engagement will also provide us with the means of developing Chinese contextual theology. Now, following which, I also suggested further that patristic studies, with its familiarity with the father's reception of Greek medicine, has much to contribute in this endeavor. After evaluating the father's discourse on Greek medicine, we glean 3 main insights. Number 1, most of the fathers did not reject Greek medicine a priori because of its pagan roots. Rather, they affirm it as a means of divine healing. Number 2, the father's discourse about medicine was focused primarily on the theological role of medicine. They saw it as a means of moderating the consequences of Adam's fall, which they saw was the cause of all diseases. But they also recognized, because scriptures say so, that they must allow for a wide range of reasons for illnesses. And so illnesses may be due to God's discipline, God's testing, or the illnesses was a covenantal symbol between God and sick. And thirdly, we also looked at the fact that the fathers were quite happy to follow the Greek philosophers in their conception of the philosophers, or in their case, pastors, as the physicians of the soul. Medical analogies then became for the fathers helpful metaphors for the practice of soul care. Now, in this second lecture, we shall turn to the fathers' views on the relationship between psychic and somatic well-being, and how this was informed by Greek anthropology. Thereafter, we shall do the same with Chinese medical anthropology before bringing the 2 traditions into dialogue with one another. And having done so, I will draw some conclusions on the theological legitimacy of Chinese medicine and what our study may mean for the development of Chinese contextual theology. Now we begin with Andrew Chryslip's Thorns in the Flesh, which is a very helpful study of the father's views on the relationship between spiritual health and physical well-being. Now, in his book, Chryslip identified 5 major views on our subject. The first is given by St. Anthony in his letters, where Christ's salvation is understood solely as the restoration of one's psyche and has very little bearing on one's bodily health. Athanasius, on the other hand, differs by exerting that the 2 are actually positively correlated. And this may be seen in how he presents Anthony as enjoying a pristine health and youthfulness, even though the monk had spent 20 years practicing a harsh asceticism in a deserted fortress. Now, an interesting variant of this view is actually given in the history of the monks in Egypt. Here we see that asceticism did take a toll on many monks. For example, John of Lycopolis was so worn out that beard no longer grew on his face. But notwithstanding this, these Egyptian monks did not pay the price of premature death for contravening medical norms. Rather, they lived on to ripe old ages, as was the case of John of Lycopolis, more than 90 years old, and Chronides, 110 years old. Now, not all fathers concurred on the health benefits of asceticism, however, which brings us to view number 3. Pachomius in his letter seemed to assume that monks will fall sick one time or another, regardless of their regimen or sanctity. And then Basil and Evagrius even warned that excessive asceticism could cut short one's life, as well as expose him to the dangers of pride or demonic influence. Now, the most radical view remains that observed in the Coptic life of Pachomius. And here we see Pachomius refusing to moderate his asceticism or to receive treatment even when he's ill. And this is because for Pachomius, sickness has become an ascesis that draws him into a deeper intimacy with God, and is a surer mark of his sanctity. Now, despite their differing attitudes about bodily health, the early Christians and indeed their pagan peers share a similar anthropological paradigm, namely the Greek conviction that the soul is fundamentally superior and therefore different from the body. Whether this means that the soul was fashioned from the stuff of stars, the seed of divinity within the mortal form, most Christians, the invisible of the image of the invisible God. In his comparative study of the social-political context of ancient Greek and Chinese sciences, G.R. Lloyd observes that Greek philosophers and politicians must constantly vie for their ideas, not to mention prestige and followers, by denying those of their competitors. Now, the net result of this is that the Greeks tend to conceptualize their ideas dualistically, mine versus theirs, and yet the ideas often take on a characteristics bias for one pole over the other. Mine is better than theirs. Now, this unilateral basis is evident not only in matters of ontology, where becoming depends upon being, but not vice versa. Appearance depends upon reality, but not vice versa. It is also prevalent in late antique society, where it is universally assumed that slaves must always be subjected to the free, and females are but deformed males. And then the Greeks are always superior to the barbarians, which is everybody else. Now, the same influence is of course played out in Platonic anthropology, where the psychic superiority is constantly emphasized. It is with this in mind that we return to the father's views on the relationship between spiritual and bodily well-being. And so, despite their apparent differences, the fathers were actually quite unanimous about the unilateral bias inherent to Platonic anthropology. Now, this can be seen in how their proposals constantly privilege the soul by assuming psychic restoration as a sine qua non of Christian salvation, while bodily health is at best a side effect or byproduct of this psychic health, or at worst, not a related issue at all. Now, once the psychosomatic relationship is framed in this way, the implication is clear. The fathers would not expect bodily health, or indeed its cultivation, to play a constructive role in one's spiritual progress or well-being. Now, these insights have significant implications for constructing Chinese contextual theology. Firstly, Greek anthropology, through the fathers' teachings, has bequeathed the same unilateral bias to classical Christianity. Now, this anthropological framework has in turn been taught to Christians both in the East and also the West. Yet, if this bias was due largely to the social-political character of classical Greek states, should it not imply that it is not intrinsic to the Christian faith? More importantly, as we shall see, Chinese anthropology was developed in a rather different cultural and political climate, and so differs from its Greek counterparts in many ways. If this is the case, should not Chinese contextual theologians employ Chinese anthropology instead as a more relevant dialogue partner for Chinese theological anthropology? Now, if the answer is yes, then how should a Chinese Christian anthropology look like? Now, for this, we must turn first to Han Confucianism and the formative role that it played in the development of Chinese anthropology. Let's turn now to Han Confucian Cosmology. Now, despite the popularity of classical or pre-imperial Chinese philosophy, which is between the period of 500 to 221 BC, it is really Han Confucianism that played a more important and enduring role in Chinese civilization. When the Hans took over and succeeded the Qins, so this was about the time of 206 BC, Confucianism was gradually adopted as their imperial ideology. Han Confucianism, however, differed from its predecessor in a few significant ways. The first is Han Confucianism's interest in forging a cosmology that will explain the three poles of reality: heaven, earth, and humankind, 天地人. Now, this they achieved through a creative synthesis of Confucian, Taoist, legalist, and other pre-Qin philosophies. Now, the net result is a cosmological vision that sees the three poles as correlated to and cannot be properly understood except in relation to one another. And so, as Lu Jia puts it, when our human deeds and virtues accord with heaven and earth, the practice of the way the Tao emerges. Now, to express these correlations, the Han philosophers then employed what are traditionally non-Confucian terms. This is what we call the Han synthesis. And the terms are qi, yin-yang, and wuxing. Now, the word qi has a wide semantic range. It's impossible to really translate it properly in English. It is commonly used to denote the air we breathe, but also the principle of life, and also the pneuma that fills the body, or simply the fundamental material stuff of the universe. Now, as for yin-yang, it is often used to describe the orderly or the disorderly movement of the qi in the regeneration process of the cosmos. As for wuxing, traditionally it was translated as the 5 elements, but that is probably not so correct. A better way of translating it is to call it the 5 agents or the 5 phases. Now, it is during the Han era that the concept of qi and yin-yang were associated together, and then they were used as a way of representing the myriad of things that were evolving and generating from yin-yang. So qi and yin-yang came together during the Han period. And so Dong Zhongsu, a Han scholar, then puts it in his luxuriant gems of the Spring and Autumn Annals, 春秋法度. He puts it this way, that the qi of the heaven and earth unites and becomes one. Then it separates into the yin-yang. Then it divides into the 4 seasons and spreads out into the wuxing, the 5 phases. Now, like their Greek counterparts, the Han's doctrine of the correlated triad enables them to demythologize, to re-envisage the Chinese cosmos as a constant flux of transformation, always regenerating itself as its constituents simultaneously change. Now, the 2 anthropologies or 2 cosmologies differs in a fundamental way. Unlike Greek philosophy, Han Confucianism developed in a context where the Han rulers offered their scholars court protection in return for their support and allegiance. Now, out of this mutuality emerged a new social order where hierarchical relationships that apply all the way from the emperors and the ministers down to the sons and fathers. And these relationships were understood as reciprocal, interdependent, and analogous to one another. Now, the significance of this bilateral correlation logic cannot be understated. After finding its way into every aspect of Chinese sciences and cosmology, it soon became the primary worldview by which the Chinese until recently understood their world. So namely, the world is a great grand synthesis where all things subsist in yin-yang relationships of mutual interdependence and reciprocity, and that none can exist in isolation from the other. Now, in the case of Chinese medical anthropology, this correlation logic was worked out in the following ways. To begin, the human being is perceived not dualistically, but in terms of a qi continuum. Now, specifically, all human organs are made from the fluid essence or jing, which are derived from qi, or if you will, they are condensations of qi. And qi in its verified form is none other than soul or shen. And this shen may be subdivided into 5 spiritual aspects, which then resides in the 5 different organ systems, according to Chinese medicine. Now, the following chart outlines each spiritual aspect with its respective organ system and the physiological, psychological functions associated with them. So, the mind, the shen, itself resides in the heart organ and is responsible for the activity of thinking, consciousness, self-identity, insight, and memory. The ethereal soul, the hun, resides in the liver, is responsible for intuition, for creative inspiration. The corporal soul, po, resides in the lungs, responsible for sensation, for feeling, hearing, sight. The intellect, yi, resides in the spleens, generating ideas and explicit memory. The willpower, 智, resides in the kidneys and is responsible for memory capability and willpower. Now, how does Chinese medical anthropology compares with its Greek counterparts? First of all, the Chinese should have perceived the relationship between spiritual and bodily well-being as less dualistic and ambiguous than that conceived by their Greek counterparts. As they see it, one's spiritual health has a direct impact on and is indeed closely related to bodily health. Second, the above scheme also suggests strongly that the relationship between the Chinese body and soul is not merely analogous, that is, just as one should take care of the body, so should we take care of the soul. So it's just an analogy. Rather, the Chinese take it for granted that physical health and well-being of a specific organ system has an immediate effect on one's psychological well-being. Now, to put it differently, what we do with our body is the food we eat, the places we live in, how much sleep we have, the physical training that we undergo will all affect our psychological health, positively or negatively. Now, in view of the above, it's hardly surprising that the Han Chinese from the onset assumed that psychic and somatic health are positively correlated and regard physical health, particularly longevity, 长生, as a mark of sanctity. And so the Warring States philosopher Zhuangzi speaks of the scholar as one who nourishes his soul so that he can become as old as Pengzu, who is apparently an 800-year-old sage. Now, the earliest Han medical classic Wang Di Nei Jing likewise regards the sage as one who lives in harmony with the yin-yang, that is in tandem with the seasons and principles of the cosmos. And in so doing, he enjoys good health and longevity. Now, eventually, healing, longevity, and immortality will be taken by the Hans as three different stages along the same continuum of the human body, and in one's journey towards perfection. And in line with their Qi ontology, the Han's conception of immortality will always be spiritual and bodily. Now, the same psychosomatic logic would see the development and practice of Taoyin healing exercises by both the Han aristocrats and later on the emerging religious Taoists in the 3rd century AD. Now, these Taoyin healing exercises, we still see them. It's now been modernized and known to us as Qigong exercises. Now, when the religious Taoists use them, they use techniques of bodily and internal Qi manipulation as an integral and important aspects of their pursuit for immortality. By the time we reach the late Ming and Qing dynasty, which is about 1500 years later, Taoyin training was in fact integrated with Chinese martial arts, so much so that the latter not only becomes a form of medical therapy for practitioners, but also a means of spiritual progress. So Taoyin healing exercises gives you health, but also becomes an ascetic practice, enables you to reflect philosophically on life. A good example is found in a Tai Chi boxing martial arts classics. It puts it this way: the ears and eyes, hands and feet, being divided into pairs like the yin and yang, and that uniting into one is like Tai Chi. And thus the external becomes concentrated in the internal, and the internal expresses itself externally. In this way, we developed within and without, the fine and the gross. And with penetrating understanding, we realize the work of the wise men and sages. Wisdom and knowledge, sagehood and immortality, these are what we mean by fulfilling our intrinsic nature and establishing life. Herein lies the perfection of spirit and divine transformation. Now, much has been covered in this lecture and also the previous one. Let me just conclude by addressing the two key questions that I set out in lecture 1. Number 1 is the use of Chinese medicine theologically legitimate. And once we answer this, we answer the question of, can Christians use them? Well, just as in the case of the father's use of Galenic medicine, I would argue that just because Han Chinese medicine is based upon Han Confucian cosmology does not disqualify it a priori on religious grounds. More importantly, I find that the Chinese understanding of human telos as living in harmony with the yin-yang of the cosmos is actually compatible with scriptural teachings. It is also instructive in two levels. Firstly, it provides insights on how humanity may be a steward of God's creation. Namely, we are to respect and to work in tandem with the rhythms of creation, rather to attempt to transcend or to surpass it. Indeed, to do otherwise will only sow discords that we cannot imagine, as it is the case now with the current problem of climate change. Secondly, the concept of yin-yang harmony is a helpful analogy for Christian living. That is, we should not only do all things in moderation, but also account for the impact our actions may have on those related to us, our neighbors, our communities. Now, to say all this is not to ignore some of the problematic elements in Chinese cosmology, which includes the idea that yin-yang generates all things perpetually without the need of a creator, and the absence of a doctrine of the fall in the Chinese view of the psychosomatic relationship. Now, these concerns can be resolved, and more importantly, they don't feature at all in Chinese medical practice. Consequently, I don't think that there are good theological grounds for dismissing Chinese medicine. Now, a fuller theological analysis of Chinese medicine can be found in my book, The Tao of Healing, Christian Perspectives on Chinese Medicine. There, I will also examine Chinese medicine further on both biblical grounds and also insights from the modern scientific revolution. So I commend the book to you if you are interested to find out more about this area. For now, I'd like to turn to our second question. What are the implications of our study for Chinese contextual theology? Or more specifically, for constructing a Chinese Christian anthropology? Well, first of all, the Chinese logic of bilateral correlation clearly allows for the body to play a more constructive role in Chinese asceticism. Contrary to the Greeks and some of the fathers, a healthy body does matter for Chinese spirituality. Now, this in turn legitimizes the use of medical therapy, herbal or otherwise, in conjunction with pastoral guidance for the treatment of psychological illnesses that presumably may hinder spiritual progress. Second, Taoyin exercises such as the Tai Chi Chuan, Tai Chi boxing, often help their practitioners develop a heightened consciousness of their psychosomatic unity and experience of the world. Apart from their apparent health benefits, surely such Taoyin healing exercises can be incorporated into Christian ascetic practices. They can be Christianized as a way of helping Christians understand how they can live in greater harmony with the world that God has created, to attain a certain understanding of personal shalom. Now, this being said, we should also heed the Father's advice, namely that after the fall, the relationship between spiritual and somatic health has been disrupted. And the health of one spirit may or may not be correlated so straightforwardly with bodily well-being. Having said this, there's also no need to adopt the Greeks' skepticism about the role of the body in spiritual progress. What we do with the body does matter for the soul. And this, I think, is the key contribution and insight of Chinese medical anthropology. So I hope that this answers well the two questions, and I commend these insights to you for further reflections. Thank you.